It was New Year's Eve, 1944. In the dim, cold sky over the North Sea, a bomber mission had turned into something nobody expected. Two B-17. Flying fortresses collided and ended up locked together, piggybacked flying for dozens of miles as one impossible hybrid. This is the story of when two B-17s piggybacked, a tale of danger, skill, and survival under extreme conditions. Let's walk through how such an improbable event unfolded, how it was sustained in the air, and what it teaches us about aircraft, airmanship, and sheer resolve. We start by setting the stage. The mission: a daylight bombing raid over Germany to hit strategic targets such as oil refineries. The formations of bombers, under threat from flak and enemy fighters, were already under strain. Many B-17s had been lost in that sortie. In the darkness and chaos, maintaining formation was vital for mutual defense, but also extremely dangerous. The Aviation Geek Club 211 bomber, call it the Little Skipper, commanded by Lieutenant Glenn Rojan, the crew was navigating back through darkness, flak, and fighter attacks. As they maneuvered to fill a gap in formation, the bomber below them, known as 9 Lives, had been hit and drifted upward. Incredibly, its top turret rammed into the lower fuselage of Little Skipper, the two aircraft locking together in mid. Imagine the shock. You hear a crunch, feel a jolt, and suddenly your bomber is heavier. Shuddering, with parts of the enemy-damaged plane now embedded in yours. The structures had intermixed turrets, tail surfaces, engines running, wires and hydraulics tangled. Yet astonishingly, the two craft remained aligned enough to continue flying as a composite. The top planes for engines were still working. In the lower plane, some engines were still running. Fires had erupted. Hydraulics and electrics and Little Skipper were damaged. Control surfaces were compromised. The crews tried maneuvers to separate, but it was impossible. From a performance standpoint, this was an exercise in extreme compromise. The combined mass drag and asymmetric damage meant that control authority was dramatically reduced. The pilots had to restrain inputs, manage power carefully, and avoid destabilizing the hybrid configuration. They recognized that returning across open sea to England would be unlikely, so they headed toward German soil, hoping for the best. As they flew, enemy anti-aircraft batteries spotted them. German observers thought they had discovered a new type of Attention bomber, something superhuman. Inside the cockpit, the decisions were agonizing. The pilots were under immense stress. Do you order the crew to bail out? But abandoning the top or bottom craft separately might cause a loss of control in the remaining section. Leak, the co-pilot especially, refused to leave his captain, knowing the attempt would likely doom both. At lower altitudes, more danger awaited. The fire in the lower plane spread, control deteriorated, and they approached terrain. In that final stretch, Rojan and Leak pulled back on the controls with all strength, even bracing themselves with feet on the console to add leverage. They tried to stall gently the composite shape before it slammed into ground. The lower plane disintegrated. Little Skipper slid, broke apart. But Rojan and Leak survived and escaped. That is the raw, dramatic arc. But let us zoom in on key features and design elements that made such a feat even remotely possible, or conversely, doomed to fail if missed. The B-17 Flying Fortress was built with ruggedness in mind. Its multiple engines, redundant systems, strong structure, and ability to absorb damage were legendary in the bomber world. That redundancy meant that even when parts of hydraulics or electrics went down, you still had backup circuits or manual fallback options. The designers had built-in structural tolerance for combat damage, which contributed heavily to survival in this odd configuration. Control surfaces on the B-17 operate through hydraulic and mechanical linkages. With damage to hydraulics, pilots often resort to manual reversion modes, using cables and backup lines. In the piggyback case, many of those systems were stressed beyond their usual envelope, demanding extraordinary control inputs, and that S part of what makes this story exceptional rather than replicable in most conditions. Aerodynamically, two fuselages strapped together produce massive drag, turbulence in the wake, interference of airflow between wings and tail surfaces, and unpredictable control coupling. Lateral stability would be fragile, pitch control compromised, yet likely volatile. The fact that the pilots could coax the assembly to maintain relative alignment and not enter a spin is a testament to judgment, small control inputs, and constant attention. Power management was also critical. Throttles had to be modulated delicately so as not to overstress the airframe or torque the configuration. One sudden surge or cut could produce relative motion that might tear apart the coupling. The fire risk meant they had to lean mixtures, manage engine cooling, and balance power between engines carefully. Furthermore, the crews had to manage weight and balance. The extra weight from the embedded lower aircraft shifted the center of gravity, making the airplane much more top-heavy or nose-heavy, depending on the angle of coupling. The pilots would have to trim meticulously, possibly altering elevator or tailplane angles outside normal limits. Another nuance: communications and situational awareness. Amid structural damage, systems loss, and smoke, the pilots had to rely on visual cues, instrument fallback, and crew coordination. The navigator and bombardier, if still operational, had to help guide toward friendly, or at least landable ground zones, often through enemy territory. The human element is central. This story is not merely about machines. It's about split-second decisions, bravery, and trust. The refusal to abandon, the discipline to avoid panic inputs, and the ingenuity to fly a configuration no one had ever tested. Those are the core selling points for storytelling in aviation history. If you were to adapt this to video, structure it by interleaving 3 threads. First, the chronological narrative, how the collision happened, what followed. Second, a technical breakdown, aerodynamic structure control challenges. And third, personal drama, crew mindset, decisions under pressure. Use overlays, diagrams showing how the turrets locked, airflow disruption, trim shifts, and control linkages under stress. Use audio dramatization, radio voices, alarms, engine hum, and sputters. Creaks of structure. You might pause at key decision points. When Rojan orders bailout, when Leak refuses, when they decide to head for Germany, when they brace for impact. At each pause, briefly explain the stakes, the alternatives, why the choice they made was rational or desperate. Invite the viewer to imagine themselves in the cockpit. Would you order evacuation? Could you risk further damage by maneuvering? One of the unique selling points of the WWII Piggybacked story is precisely its unlike. This isn't a heroic bombing raid or dogfight narrative. Instead, it reveals how under extreme failure, airmanship combined with robust design and courage can still push the envelope. The fact that anyone survived is already astounding. That alone attracts curiosity, discussion. Another selling point is the visualization contrast. The hybrid aircraft looms like a science fiction monstrosity, yet it was real. In German logs, observers thought it was a new kind of bomber. That surreal image appeals broadly aviation buffs, history lovers, general audiences curious about human extremes. From a performance angle, the narrative shows both the limits and latent flexibility of aircraft design under real-world duress. It reveals how structural margins, redundancy, and design foresight can turn what would be total catastrophe into survivable disaster. It's a kind of stress test in real time of the B-17 platform. In balancing technical detail and accessibility, you should avoid overwhelming viewers with jargon but don't be shy. Away from naming key terms. Center of gravity, control coupling, trim, structural stress, aerodynamic interference. When you introduce them, pause to define in simple language. Control coupling means that when you move it slightly moves the rudder too when the airflow is disturbed, or trim is how you balance the aircraft, so the pilot doesn't need to hold constant pressure. Also, sprinkle in human context. Crews had training and emergency procedures, but none for 2 planes stuck together. They improvised. They leaned on mental models, instincts, and mutual trust. That tension between textbook and improvisation is a compelling thread. You should also acknowledge uncertainty. We don't know exactly what the lower crew experienced, or precisely how the impact forces were distributed. Some of the accounts come from afterward, from crew debriefs and archival records. That ambiguity adds to the mystique. Towards the conclusion, but not a final wrap, you might compare this to other rare midder collisions or survival stories. Contrast this with routine bomber missions or damaged planes that limp home individually. Highlight what makes this case exceptional. Emphasize that while the event is exceptional, it also teaches durable lessons about design, risk margins, and human performance under extreme stress. Allow time to show archival images, diagrams, testimonial quotes, and maybe simulated reconstructions. Use gradual pacing. Slow down in key tension moments. The collision, fire spread, final descent, speed through low attention, linking, narration. That rhythm keeps viewers emotionally invested but not overwhelmed by technical density. In sum, When Two B-17s Piggybacked offers a rare window into both man and machine at their breaking point. And a story that pushes the boundary between disaster and miracle. Use visual aids, narrative pacing, and occasional technical interludes to help viewers understand not just what happened, but how and why it was possible and what it cost.